And if you don't want to use programmable, surveillable money, whether it's from the private sector or the public sector, you should think about what you will do to avoid interacting with such money and having your income surveilled.
Whitney Webb has just gone and exposed how the biggest financial institutions in the world, such as the Fed and BlackRock, are trying to gain more control over your life. In order to understand, first let's go back to March of this year, when Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell claimed that the U.S. wasn't close to pursuing a CBDC and that it wouldn't involve spying on Americans. But here's the twist. Back in 2023, when banks began collapsing, we were told everything was fine and that liquidity was strong. In reality, it was far from it. Since then, massive amounts of money have been printed to prop up markets, which has led to what many see as falsified liquidity. It's there on paper, but it's just more money being printed, driving inflation. Fast forward to now, the talk of pursuing a digital currency continues, despite claims otherwise. When sanctions were imposed on Russia in March 2022, something slipped under the radar. Executive Order 14067. It called for the responsible development of digital assets, opening the door to exploring CBDCs under the guise of digital dollars or stablecoins.
Trump, or at least what Trump expressed or hinted at in his speech, because he didn't, as far as RFKs went, he was more deliberate about what his policies specific. And Trump was a little more vague, but based on what, Trump said, talking about sort of yoking Bitcoin and the dollar together and using that to expand the dollar's power and hegemony globally, and then also bringing in stable coins, which of course would be in this case dollar denominated stable coins into the play. We have to consider what that means if the reason we're voting for it is to ensure that Bitcoin will be used to propagate financial freedom globally. So, if you're of the opinion that you want Bitcoin to be, hyper Bitcoinization to come at all costs, even if that means it not being a tool for financial freedom anymore, or it being used by intelligence agencies to surveil people, or by Wall Street to, do their thing, then maybe it's fine. But if you're of the idea that, I want Bitcoin to be empowered to end irresponsible fiscal policy at the national level and want it to ensure financial freedom for everybody, then I don't think Trump's policies necessarily spell that out, unfortunately.
Interestingly, Congress recently passed a bill seemingly banning the Federal Reserve from issuing a CBDC. But what they really banned was the term CBDC, not the actual concept of a government-issued digital currency. Now here's where it gets tricky. The U.S. government is pushing for a stablecoin, essentially a government-backed digital currency that is technically a CBDC, but it's being branded differently. Stablecoins are typically issued by private companies, but when issued by a government, they become CBDCs. Congress introduced a bill earlier this year for a government-issued stablecoin, which aligns with the broader strategy to roll out digital currencies under a different name. This isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. Countries like Russia and the BRICS nations are also advancing their plans for CBDCs, partly accelerated by the sanctions and geopolitical events of the last few years. Many of these nations are now embracing blockchain technology as part of a larger strategic shift.
Reid Hoffman and David Sachs and Elon Musk are all part of the so-called PayPal mafia. They just happen to fund different parties, and all of these oligarchs, at the end of the day, do they frame the reasoning for why they want these policies differently. They agree about more biometric surveillance, they agree about digital ID, and they ultimately agree about programmable, surveillable currency, whether it's a CBDC or a private bank digital currency that's also surveillable and programmable. So, if you're against those things as policies, it's important to pay attention to the policies and not so much the campaign rhetoric, because people tend to forget, during a campaign season, that campaigns are essentially sales pitches, and very few people, when they campaign, actually keep their campaign promises once in office. And one example would be, Trump back in 2016, in 2015, campaigning that he was going to reinstate Glass-Steagall, and then when he was actually in office, allowed banks to be deregulated even further. And of course, there's plenty of examples for that for the Democrats as well. Obama being, a really glaring one with, being against the big banks during the 2008 economic crisis, and then having his entire cabinet essentially being chosen by Citigroup, right? which arguably caused the crisis and had Glass-Steagall repealed to facilitate its merger in the late 90s. So, I mean, this is kind of stuff that, people forget, and it kind of makes me unpopular for bringing it up. I mean, some people don't.
In recent weeks, there's been a noticeable push from major corporations like JP Morgan and Amazon to promote mass adoption of biometric payment systems. You've probably seen how these companies are rolling out ways to pay using your face or palm. For instance, Amazon is expanding these types of payment methods, and JP Morgan is doing the same, offering them to their clients as voluntary options for now. But what's the next step? It's not hard to imagine a future where this becomes the only way you can make payments. In addition, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, has recently suggested that private land should be seized by the government for the development of clean energy projects aimed at addressing climate change. This lines up with the concept of 15-minute cities, where everything you need is within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. People should really look into these, as they're part of a bigger trend toward controlling how we live and interact with our environments. What's important to know is that Dimon has strong ties to the World Economic Forum and openly supports many of its policies. As the head of JP Morgan, one of the banks considered too big to fail, he's in a unique position of influence. After the Silicon Valley Bank crisis, JP Morgan was one of the clear winners, as people flocked to it, believing their money would be safest there. The federal government essentially signaled that these mega banks, like JP Morgan, would be protected at all costs. This sets the stage for JP Morgan's biometric payments. Right now, they're introducing these features as optional, but what happens when they decide that biometric verification, using your face, fingerprints, or palm, is the only way you can access your money or make payments? With so much power concentrated in a few institutions like JP Morgan, it's not a stretch to imagine that becoming a reality.
All the stuff that you said about data and just, I mean, we basically did freely put it out there and now they're using it against us. And you talked in your last piece about how data is pretty much the most liquid commodity and they can weaponize it. And it's so crazy because now all that information's already out there. How do you even remove yourself? And you're right. It's like, no matter who you vote in, you could get really passionate about politics. And I loved what Edward Snowden said at the conference. It's like, vote, but don't join a cult. But like, literally, how do you fix all of this?
Well, something like Palantir is a really good example of how bipartisan that is. Every administration that's in office, whether it's Democrat or Republican, gives them more and more and more and more and more contracts, and a lot of these other companies that are sort of in the universe of Palantir, like Anduril and Clearview AI, the same is true there as well. So, again, these are policies that are going to expand regardless of who's in power. Maybe you could debate about maybe it will advance slower with one party than the other, but ultimately, it's the same agenda. And a lot of that goes back to the fact that they're bankrolled, both parties, by, differing factions, I guess, of Silicon Valley oligarchs. But those guys agree about widespread financial surveillance and, programmable money and biometric digital ID, which are sort of the foundation for a lot of this stuff and the Sustainable Development Goals, which is really, was written by bankers and isn't really about sustainable development.
We've already seen signs of this consolidation. Right after the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, people were already saying that JP Morgan was going to benefit the most. Many rushed to move their accounts to the bank because it seemed like the safest option, thanks to government signals. This shift is part of a broader policy agenda, one that includes not just biometric payments, but also central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, programmable money, and more. It's clear that Dimon is fully on board with these initiatives. But if you think your money is safer at JP Morgan just because it's a large, government-backed institution, you might want to consider the long-term cost to your financial freedom and civil liberties. This is where people should really start questioning the direction things are headed. It's also worth remembering how crypto was once seen as the rebel against these centralized financial systems. But now, with everything on the blockchain, tracked, digital, and traceable, even crypto is becoming an accelerant for this elite control system. Bitcoin, for instance, is fully on-chain, making it easy to track and monitor. This shifts the narrative away from crypto being an escape and shows it's playing a role in building the very system it was supposed to fight against.
But that actually makes me think of a question for you related to Bitcoin, because a lot of people want to vote orange. They really just want to pick the candidate that is going to be most friendly to Bitcoin. And I know you've done a lot of research and work in this area, because when we went to the Bitcoin conference, we did see a lot of conservative figures. Trump came out and said he's going to be for Bitcoin and embrace it. We had RFK Jr. since last year saying he has policies that are going to be pro-Bitcoin. And then the Biden and Kamala administration, they've been the most hostile. I think some people are trying to open up communication lines, but they haven't been going that well. Can you offer your take on specifically related to Bitcoin, the people that are passionate about financial freedom and the candidates that we have to select from?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty obvious that it's the conservative camp really only, aside from, RFK being an independent, that are interested in really appealing to the Bitcoin base at all as it relates to electoral politics. And they've done so very successfully. But I think, again, what you're seeing here is sort of what we saw over the course of the past year, was sort of Wall Street warming up to Bitcoin. And what we're seeing, it's just another extension of the establishment cozying up to Bitcoin, I guess. So I guess you could frame, Larry Fink's about face and all of that as sort of the private sector establishment turnaround, and this is sort of the public sector establishment turnaround.
In light of all this, it's important to pay attention to how this transition to digital currencies is being framed. For example, in 2020, even before the pandemic, there were already conversations about moving away from physical cash. Then when the pandemic hit, governments quickly started pushing for digital currencies as a safer alternative to physical money. The timeline of this shift is telling. Back in January 2020, the global map of CBDCs, Central Bank Digital Currencies, showed only a few countries experimenting with the concept. But by January 2021, the landscape had changed dramatically. In just 1 year, the push for CBDCs accelerated, driven by major institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. Now, when you look at the global conversation around CBDCs, it's clear this is the direction we're heading. The IMF has been very open about this. In November 2022, IMF Director Kristalina Georgieva made it clear that there's no turning back, stating that CBDCs could replace cash entirely. The World Economic Forum has echoed similar sentiments. They want digital currencies to take over from physical cash, and they'll use any major event, be it a pandemic or geopolitical tensions, to push this agenda forward. Take a look at the situation with Russia, for instance. After sanctions were imposed, Russia still needed to trade and complete transactions. What did they do? They started exploring crypto and digital currencies. In response, the US began to take action as well. While publicly banning the term CBDC, the government has been pushing for a stablecoin, which, as many have pointed out, is essentially the same thing under a different name. All of this shows that the move toward digital currencies is deliberate and strategic. As the IMF and other global institutions have stated, this shift is part of the larger plan to phase out cash and control the global economy through digital systems.
And the United Nations, for example, has been beta testing that exact system for years on the most vulnerable people in the world, on refugees, through things like the Building Blocks program of the World Food Program, where refugees have to scan their eyeball and make a digital ID and have a digital wallet, and they can go in and get their, rations, but only if they scan their eyeball. They have to pay with their face, otherwise they don't eat. They've been testing this on the most vulnerable people on the world, but it's a system that's intended for everybody, ultimately. Yeah. So I think if we want to stop this, it's not about, maybe you can vote for the party you think will implement it more slowly, right? But that's not going to defeat the policy. What will defeat the policy is people opting out.
Yeah.
So if you think about, what happened with COVID, like vaccine passports, sort of as a trial run for digital ID, how did you avoid working with vaccine passports? Well, you had to opt out. It was kind of inconvenient. You weren't allowed to go places or do things that other people with them could do. And the same is going to be true with digital ID. So we had that test run with COVID. If you want to oppose digital ID and not participate in that system and opt out, which if you care about really human freedom, you should, then you should think about what you will do to opt out and not
Yeah.
interact with those systems. And if you don't want to use programmable, surveillable money, whether it's from the private sector or the public sector, you should think about what you will do to avoid interacting with such money and having your income surveilled. And exactly how much you think is safe for you to interact with that system. But I would argue the safest is to not interact with it at all.
In places where CBDCs have been launched or tested, adoption is slow. People aren't jumping on board immediately for several reasons. They don't trust it, they prefer using payment methods they're familiar with, and there's not much in it for businesses to push this new form of money. But here's where things get interesting. Central banks and governments know they can't just introduce a CBDC and expect everyone to adopt it overnight. So how do they plan to get people to use it? By incentivizing it. And this is where we need to be cautious. Imagine a future where they offer to wipe your debt or even provide a monthly income if you switch over to a CBDC. Sounds great at first, right? But let's rewind to 2020 for a second. Remember when stimulus checks were handed out during the pandemic? People loved the free money. They spent it, the markets rallied, and for a short while, everything seemed great. But then inflation hit, and those same people who were thrilled about the extra cash started complaining about rising costs. This was a classic case of not thinking about the long-term consequences, which is exactly what could happen with CBDCs. Governments might offer you a sweet deal to use their digital currency, but once you're in, cash could be phased out entirely. It's already happening in small ways. Look at WorldCoin, where people are lining up to scan their retinas for $10. This is a preview of what's to come with CBDCs. People are quick to accept these small rewards without thinking about the long-term implications. Some might say, we'll just refuse to use CBDCs. But the reality is that most people won't. We've seen this before, where the majority goes along with the system, especially when big players are involved. And speaking of big players, let's talk about BlackRock, the financial giant that's everywhere, including the world of crypto and CBDCs. In January 2023, banks were worried about USDC, a stablecoin created by Circle, becoming a gateway for CBDCs, with BlackRock heavily involved. Fast forward to now, and BlackRock is even more entrenched in CBDC projects worldwide. They've had a hand in Hong Kong's digital currency initiative, and this is just one example. BlackRock's influence stretches across the entire financial system, and they're deeply tied to the World Economic Forum, an organization pushing for more centralized control over the global economy. Whenever there's a crisis, like the 2008 financial meltdown or the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank earlier this year, big banks like JP Morgan swoop in to clean up, gaining even more power in the process.
So, a good example of that would be the 2008 economic crisis. BlackRock was basically sent in to help handle the banker bailouts. And then during COVID, when Trump was in office, BlackRock was brought in to essentially design the COVID fiscal policy, which the ramifications of which we're still dealing with. That's just one example, but there's so much, whether it's funding wars or funding, the state of Israel, for example, with billions of U.S. tax dollars and things like that. There tends to be bipartisan consensus about a lot of things. But I think, there's an effort to sort of frame this as an election that's not that. And, each group in their particular, partisan silos, think their candidate is going to be the answer and magically reverse all of this stuff. But unfortunately, both are essentially, bankrolled by, major forces in Silicon Valley specifically. And a lot of those Silicon Valley oligarchs tend to double as contractors to both the military and also intelligence communities. And so, maybe you'll have sort of the PayPal mafia crowd behind Trump this time, maybe because of JD Vance, but he's got, David Sachs and Elon Musk and people like that in his corner. And even though Peter Thiel's being quite quiet, there seems to be some overlap there as well, which we can get into later. And then, of course, on the Kamala side, you have people like Reid Hoffman and Eric Schmidt, who are also share a lot of overlap with the oligarchs on the other side.
And now with CBDCs on the horizon, they're poised to benefit yet again. Contrary to what some might think, CBDCs aren't going to eliminate banks. In fact, they could make the biggest banks even more powerful. Central banks and governments want control, and CBDCs give them the perfect tool to achieve that. This brings us to the bigger picture. Every move we've seen, from the introduction of stablecoins to the executive orders around digital currencies, points to one thing: a future where CBDCs dominate the financial landscape. Look at Executive Order 14,067. This laid the groundwork for a shift toward digital money in the US. Even though officials claim they aren't pursuing a CBDC right now, but actions speak louder than words. Despite these reassurances, we're already witnessing the groundwork for a fully digital financial system. Banks are experimenting, central banks are lighting up on the global map as they explore CBDCs, and it's clear that the vast majority, around 98% of the world's central banks, are seriously looking into digital currencies. It's only a matter of time before we all transition to a digital-only financial world, where cash becomes a relic of the past. Some experts predict this shift could take 6 to 10 years, but it's likely to happen even sooner. Major events like pandemics or geopolitical tensions will serve as catalysts to push the agenda forward. Just as we saw with COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, global crises create the perfect environment for rapid policy shifts. And before you know it, digital transactions could become the only option. Why do you think this is happening now? Let us know in the comments below.